Okay, good morning. We are going to talk about Chapter 11, Lesson 3, the end of the Roman Republic. So, first, we need to talk about some of the problems that are happening, especially for the poor farmers. So, the farmers are falling into poverty. They cannot pay off their debts. So, why was this? Well, first of all, many of them have been off fighting in the Roman wars, and of course you can't tend your fields very well when you're not there, so their fields were neglected and therefore they were not able to have crops to sell. Also, their farms could have been destroyed during the various Punic Wars, right, by the Carthaginians coming, remember the last one, or the second to last one, when a lot of Italy was destroyed. So the farmers cannot pay back their loans. When they can't pay their loans to the wealthy, then the wealthy can buy up their farms at a good price, and they start combining these smaller farms to make these very large farming estates called latifundia. And unfortunately, many of them are really struggling to find any kind of job because there is such an overabundance of prisoners of war becoming slave labor. The wealthy would rather spend the money on just getting, they could, use their money to buy up all these estates because they don't have to pay people to work for them. They have these free slave labor. So, unfortunately, it's very hard. And even when they flood into the cities looking for jobs, also there's slave labor in the city jobs too. And so when they do find any kind of job, it is very low paying because there's so much competition. So there's a lot of unhappiness with the poor, and the leaders start really worrying that there could be a rebellion. So what they came up with was something that's termed bread and circuses, meaning they are going to provide food at a very cheap price so that they can eat and fill their bellies and, be contented enough. And then they're going to offer them free entertainment so that's going to distract them, right? And so you can see in the picture here, they have different races. Gladiator fighting, we'll talk about later, is going to become a big form of entertainment too. So various, that's what the circuses is. They don't mean literal like we think of a circus with the elephants and the clowns. They just mean some kind of entertainment, okay? All right, not everyone was just worrying about themselves. There were some who were trying to make some reforms. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were two wealthy brothers, and they thought that what the wealthy were doing was terrible, and they needed to stop taking over all the small farms. And they actually tried to urge the senators to return some of the land to the poor. But of course, who's in the Senate, right? The rich, wealthy, landowners who had these latifundia. So it was not very popular. And eventually they were both killed. Remember, during this time, killing your political opponents, right, or other opponents is a way of dealing with your problems. So Tiberius was killed first by a group of senators in 133 BC, and then his brother also was murdered a little bit later, about 12 years later. So reforming, not a very safe occupation. All right. So what also happens during this time, a little change, is military leaders are getting very powerful and seeking control. And so that's why we're going to end up with the end of the Republic, okay? So for the first one was Marius. Marius was a general in 107 who was able to become consul. And consuls, right, are in the government, but he was a professional, he was a soldier, but he was not from a patrician. He was actually, his dad was just a worker. And so he wanted, to help the plight of the common people. And he made a huge change. Before this, the army, it was filled with property owners doing their duty and serving in the military. But he chose to make it a professional army. So he said to the poorer people, you can come and be in the army and I will pay you, and I promise you I'm going to get you some land. So not only is he helping the people who are, struggling to not have a job, what ends up happening is the generals who hire these people become very powerful, and the soldiers start feeling more loyalty to that general who hired them and paid them than they do to the, ideals of the republic in general. And so the military, so this is a huge change, that the military leaders are going to become very powerful. So not too long after that, another general, Sulla, he decides to use his army in 82 BC to drive out all of his enemies and to actually name himself dictator. Now remember, we talked about dictators and how they thought that was okay for a very short period of time, but usually they're asked to do it by the Senate. And so he just kind of took over and made himself the dictator. He made some changes. He reduced the power of the tribunes and he gave the senators more. So he's trying to put things kind of back to what he thought it was in the earlier days. He thought that it shouldn't be like it has become, with the patricians having more power and things like that. And so he's trying to kind of put it back, supposedly. And then he steps down as dictator. He had done all this, by the way, by using his army to bring it into the capital. That's what this picture is showing. And physically, taking over, the capital of Rome, right? So, so that's showing that power in politics is changing during this time. So after Sulla, you see different leaders fighting for power. And eventually 3 men are going to get control, and they're going to become what they call the first triumvirate. A triumvirate is when 3, obviously the root word there, 3 rulers are sharing power. So Crassus, Julius Caesar, and Pompey are the 3 people. And they kind of split up the Roman control, so they each kind of took an area to rule. So Crassus had Syria, Julius Caesar had Gaul, which would have been France and Belgium back then, and Pompey had Spain. And that was okay for a little while, but Caesar got very powerful because he had some big wins. He fought in Britain, and he got a lot of admiration for his wins, and he was a lot of support from the poorer people. And so he is seen as a threat, especially after Crassus dies in battle, and basically the triumvirate is over, right? Because there's not 3 of them anymore, and it's basically Pompey versus Caesar for control. So the Senate is so worried about Caesar's, popularity that they're afraid that he may try to take over like Sulla did. And so they decide that they're going to put their support towards Pompey, and they order Caesar to give up his army and return to Rome. And of course, probably rightly so, Caesar is afraid that if he does that and comes back to Rome, they'll probably imprison or likely kill him, right? Because that's what would happen to, get rid of your political enemies. So he had a decision to make. He can either, listen to what they want and take his chances, or he could, fight back. And so he decides. He supposedly had a vision that told him that he should go ahead and march back into Italy. And so he was crossing the Rubicon River. The reason that becomes like a famous saying, crossing the Rubicon, that you may hear today. it means like he had to decide once he crossed over into that other territory that wasn't his to control, right? And he comes in with his army. It's like an act of war, right? And so once he does this, you can't go back. It's a decision you're making that it can't be taken back. So that's what that saying kind of means today, crossing the Rubicon. So you might see it in a meme or, mentioned on a sitcom or something. And now you'll understand what they mean by that. Okay. So he does go take his army. He fights back. He captures all of Italy and he goes after Pompey and he beats him in Greece and he takes over. Okay, so he declares himself dictator for life, which remember, dictator was supposed to be a temporary thing. So they weren't so wrong, right? He did want the power. So that was in 44 BC. All these dates, you don't really have to memorize. I'm just throwing them in there so you kind of have an idea where we are in the timeline. And he makes sure that he appoints senators who are supportive of him, so he won't have any problem with, right, people going against him. He puts in a series of reforms, and many people think that a lot of what he did was very good. He gave citizenship to people who lived in the territories. Remember, we talked about how sometimes they didn't have full citizenship. He made jobs for the unemployed. He, remember, one of the problems is all the use of slave labor. So he orders that the landowners have to hire some. You can't just use all slave labor to try to give, help to the people who need jobs. He also ordered the creation of a new calendar, which of course is named after him. So it's called the Julian calendar. It was 12 months, 365 days, and a leap year. And this was the common calendar used all the way up until 1582 AD. And then at that time later, they put in what they call the Gregorian calendar, which we'll talk about later. But basically, the change there is they eventually decide to start the calendar on the date of Jesus's birth. That's year 0. So that's a change. And that's, of course, the one we still use today, right? The Gregorian calendar. Okay. So even though he was very popular with the common people and he actually probably put in a decent amount of good ideas, the wealthy don't like him. And a lot of people don't like that he has taken over and basically made himself king, right? And so there's a plot to kill him. He is killed by senators, stabbed 23 times in the Senate. It is said that this was led by Brutus and Cassius. And there's a lot of misunderstanding a little bit about what's true or not, because William Shakespeare wrote a play called Julius Caesar. And in it, a lot of people remember the things that, Shakespeare wrote. But remember, he's a playwright. He is trying to do things that are dramatic, and just because he wrote them doesn't mean that they are true. So, for instance, excuse me, there's a famous line in there about beware the Ides of March. Back then in Rome, Ides of March was the 15th of March, meant like mid-month, right? And it was like a thing. So apparently he had been told by a kind of like a fortune teller, the soothsayer, they called him, that you should beware of that date. And actually, Caesar makes it sound like that actual day it was told not, that it was bad. Actually, there's some history that maybe he did hear that, but then it would have been ended by the 15th. Anyway, he does go to the Senate. Also, Shakespeare kind of gets wrong. Like, there was someone else who probably was a worse betrayer, because actually, I've read that he had decided, Caesar, not to go to the Senate that day, but then he was convinced by someone to go, to make sure they got him there. And so really that person should be kind of famous, Decimus. But, Shakespeare didn't really talk about him, so he didn't become famous. Also, the other two were more notable in history, right? Better speakers and more charismatic, and so that's probably why they're kind of known in history. Anyway, so he goes and he gets killed, and again, Shakespeare says, he said, "Et tu, Brute," and that means you too, Brutus, like my friend, betraying me even. And again, there's no evidence that he actually said that, but it's famous. Okay, so anyway, so they do kill him. And after his death, a civil war breaks out. Who's going to get power? Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew, Octavian, is joined by two of Caesar's top generals, Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus. And those three are going to end up becoming the next triumvirate. So they call it the second triumvirate. And they, got control, and they are going to rule the empire together. They split it up also. So Octavian had Italy and in the west, and Mark Antony had Greece in the east, and Marcus Lepidus had North Africa. Okay, so it didn't last very long, though, because Lepidus decides to retire. And then basically there's two again, and those two become rivals. Now, Antony falls in love with Cleopatra. Okay, now what your book doesn't mention is that supposedly there's good evidence that Cleopatra actually had an affair with Caesar and even a son. And she had been living in Italy with him, as a mistress, right? And they don't mention that in the book at all. I'm not sure why, because there's a good amount of evidence. And anyway, so now she falls in love with, or, they fall in love, and they make an alliance. Now, it'd be really interesting to learn more about this, because I think Cleopatra probably was trying to make alliances with whoever she could so she could make sure she kept control of her empire, right? But anyway, they make an alliance. They're together. Octavian spins that and says, see, she's going to help Antony take over, right? We're going to have another problem with someone like trying to, rule through the military and take over the whole thing. So the senators and Rome, they think, oh, Octavian's right. Antony's the bad guy, right? And so anyway, Antony goes to war with Octavian goes to war with Antony. And Cleopatra and her navy and everything try to help Antony. Okay, so they go into the fighting. And so there's a famous Battle of Actium, which is off the coast of Greece. And it's basically Octavian versus Antony and Cleopatra. To make a long story short, Octavian wins. And so he takes over the city of Alexandria, and Egypt is going to become part of Rome. And so there's an interesting story here about both Antony and Cleopatra committing suicide. The story goes that Antony heard a false rumor that Cleopatra was dead. And so he kills himself and right, his political life is over and now his love is gone, so he kills himself. Then supposedly Cleopatra hears that news and then she commits suicide. Also, there's some, talks about how she did that, right? And so I have a video I will show you. Anyway, long story short, Octavian becomes the ruler. Now, the other thing you should know is during this time period, there's been a very famous writer, influential writer and politician, Cicero. And Cicero has been making a lot of statements that, dictators can't be trusted and we really should restore things back how they used to be, like a representative government. Okay. So Octavian is very smart. And he knows he has to be careful. So he wants to have complete control, and he doesn't really believe that a republic is strong enough. But he publicly supports the republic, and he gets the Senate basically to say that he is the consul, the tribune, and the commander in chief for life. So in effect, he is, right, the dictator or the complete ruler, but still in the guise of going along with how a representative government should look. And then he takes the title Augustus, and Augustus means majestic one. And so from now on, you will hear him in history called Caesar Augustus. Oh, I should have capitalized that. Caesar Augustus is his new title. Okay, remember, he's from the Caesar family, and Augustus meaning the emperor, right? So it's a little confusing that from in history now his name is kind of changed. And so just so you can keep it clear for yourself, Octavian is the same person as Caesar Augustus. Okay, it's just a title change. But he becomes the first emperor of Rome.